nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurum Īśvaram. Itam Sri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Nama Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo. Adadanas Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanas Trinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyudisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Hechurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Ya Bhakti Nikhilartha Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Pradavishaya Jatsukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhujayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Brajaloka Vad Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Ya Ramya Nikhilaga Sangha Shamani Shrutra Tritim Sangata Ya Svadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So, let me just here. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we continue our discussion of Padyavali, and in particular we've come to the fourth verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, the final verse of this prakaran on Sotsukya Prarthana, or prayers full of eagerness. So in our last discussion we covered Kaviraj Goswami Pad's introduction to this verse, how the intensifying dainya or humility in the heart of Mahaprabhu gave rise to this prayer in the progression found in the Shikshastakam. And we also looked at verses of similar import that are cited by Rupa Goswami in some of his works, by Jiva Goswami, and found in the Mukundamala Stotra and other places in the Bhagavatam. So today we'll start what will be probably multiple days of discussion of nitty-gritty. So I hope people are up for some subtle analysis of Bhakti Tattva here, because we're going to dive into it. And we'll start with some analysis of the elements in the first half of the verse, and then we're going to go in depth on the concept of ahaitukī, or causeless bhakti. So that we embark on today. So I start with the top of the new file, which begins the analysis of the content of the verse specifically. So, in the verse under discussion, the mention of wealth, dhanaṁ, is explained by various commentators to refer to gold, silver, jewels, pearls, and the like. More broadly, it can be understood to refer to money, possessions, property, and so on. That is, any and all objects found in earthly life, or in life in other planes within the realm of samsara, that are a cause of, or a means to, pleasure for the gross and subtle bodies. And just for reference here, when I say, quote, the commentators in the plural, because throughout the Padyavali I'm drawing repeatedly from the Rasika-rangada-tika of one Sri Viracandra Gosvami Prabhupada, but in the case of the Shikshastakam, I've gone through about 10 Sanskrit commentaries on the text. So the specific commentaries that are being referred to separately are referred to in the footnotes, and I've just collectively drawn from various ones according to the points made. So those are, I won't go into the details of that, but they're in the footnotes for anyone who wants to see the sources. So in other words, wealth can be taken in general, as was discussed. The mention of, quote, people, janaṁ, is explained by commentators to refer to wife, children, friends, relatives, assistants, servants, subjects, followers, and so on. More broadly, it refers to all persons whose company is valued for the sake of worldly interests. The mention of, quote, beautiful women, sundarīṁ, is explained by commentators to refer to wives and other women who resemble apsaras, or to apsaras as well as wives and other beautiful women. More broadly, the mention of beautiful women is to be understood as an indicator, or upalakshana, of any and all objects of sexual attraction for an aspirant on the path of bhakti, which in the case of some will be beautiful women specifically. So we discussed the use of gendered language and the concept of an upalakshana in a recent Chaitanya Charitamrita class on the subject of asatsanga. So I'm not going to go into that whole topic, but for that subject matter, one can see that discussion there. And so finally, the fourth element, the mention of poeticism, kavitāṁ, is said to refer to the ability to compose poetry, and more broadly refers to erudition in general. Some commentators alternately read the word sundarīṁ as a modifier of kavitāṁ, and interpret this phrase to refer to poeticism replete with ornaments that evoke lokik, or worldly rasa, and more broadly to knowledge and poeticism in general that are not employed in kirtan of Sri Bhagavan. So, broadly speaking, you can say in the cultural context in which the Shikshastakam was composed, the role of a kavi was something of both learning as well as social prestige. Poets were persons who would receive royal patronage, who would travel throughout the areas doing, quote, digvijay, or, conquering the directions. In other words, there were competitions and a whole social status of demonstration of learning in grammar and poetry and various other fields of knowledge, such as nyaya. And this was a major feature of medieval Indian culture. So in today's context, while the role of the pundit isn't quite as prestigious, so to speak, as it was in those days, nevertheless, we have, the academy and the prestige enjoyed by, professors of the academy at various academic institutions, and we have, the role of, arguably you could lump social media influencers and persons who are what they call in classical language vidyajivis, or those who live by doing some type of art. In other words, by being a celebrity, an actor, a musician, in other words, to have any kind of specialized knowledge, art, or skill that gives one distinguished recognition, a distinguished means of income, etc. in society. Broadly, we can lump all of that under this category. So, further broadly, we can say that these four categories are not meant to be tight, they're meant to be loose. In other words, he's not trying to only speak to four specific points, he's just trying to give 4 points that refer to basically everything other than bhakti. And then how you want to map the categories to cover that is more or less as per convenience. The commentator on Padyavali also interprets the word va, so he says kavitāṁ va, to refer to moksha and other objects, such as siddhis that can be attained by various forms of yoga practice. So the word va can be used like the English word or it can be used a little bit like what we say in English etc. as well. The word can convey either sense in Sanskrit, so this particular commentator takes it to refer to the, quote, etc. sense and to allude to mokshas and siddhis, which is certainly in keeping with the overall idea that he's trying to say, I want only bhakti and nothing other than bhakti. So it's fair enough to assume that there's a, quote, etc. in this verse, and that the two biggest elements not mentioned, which are commonly desired, would be moksha and siddhis. So collectively, all of these objects listed in the first half of the verse under discussion can be broadly categorized as twofold. All forms of worldly enjoyment, bhukti, which are the outcome of dharma, artha, and kama, and all forms of mukti, that is, forms of release from the bondage of worldly existence. So in the Charitamrita, we see use of these two terms in tandem, bhukti and mukti. The oldest text I've seen them paired in that way is the Stotra Ratna of Yamunacharya, in a verse that we discussed some time back. Bhukti mukti kritanuttama, that where he prays, I want the association of bhaktas for whom bhukti and mukti are no more valuable than grass. So we can say this is a twofold category, or you can make it a fourfold category with a etc. at the end. Basically, we just want to allude to everything other than the specific object of bhakti. So then Mahaprabhu says, I desire neither, na kāmaye. This is said in the sense of, I do not request or beg for any of these objects. And I think I hear some sound. If anyone's mic is on, would you mind muting it? The repeated placement throughout the verse of the negative particle na, prior to the objects being negated in the verse, indicates utter disregard for the objects of negation. Meaning, Sriman Mahaprabhu does not want to convey that he does not desire these objects only on some particular occasion or only in some particular circumstance, but rather to convey that categorically and in principle, under all circumstances, he does not foster desire for any of these objects specifically, since desiring such objects specifically is antithetical to the spirit of Uttama Bhakti. Why is this so? Because in gist, quote, wealth, people, beautiful women, and poeticism can be causes of passion, conceit, blindness, meaning delusion, insensitivity, and the like, and other forms of absorption in objects apart from Bhagavan and Bhakti. That is, they can obstruct absorption in Bhakti to Bhagavan by diverting one's awareness, energy, and time away from Bhakti and Bhagavan. Bhaktas thus foster no specific desire for them. Also, the subject of Bhakta's disinterest in moksha specifically is further discussed by the compiler later in Padyavali. So we're going to elaborate on that topic later on. So we're not going to spend as much time on that here. But we will come back to some of these elements and why they're negated in more detail later in this discussion. But for now, we come to the heart of the discussion, which is the thing that's being preferred in preference to these things. But one other couple transitional points before we get there. Sriman Mahaprabhu addresses Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the verse under discussion as, quote, the Lord of the universe, jagad-īśa, and Īśvara, to convey that Bhagavan Sri Krishna is capable of accomplishing anything and everything, and of bestowing any and all desired ends that a worshipper seeks from him. The import being that although he could pray for and receive from Sri Krishna any of the aforementioned objects, he does not do so because in principle he does not want any of them. So we'll also look at examples of bhaktas who also receive the opportunity to be given whatever they want from Bhagavan and what they end up choosing. So what this invites in terms of reflection is the hypothetical matter of, if I could have whatever I want, what would I wish for? In fairy tales or in, vision questing or these type of things, sometimes this type of exercise is done, where someone could say, if I, could have whatever I would wish for, then what would I really want? In other words, what's truly worthy of having? What's truly of the greatest value? This is an extremely central topic to leading a successful life. So if we create this hypothetical question, it's not a waste of time because we can't actually have it, but it's a way of refining our understanding of what's really worthy of being wanted. So by thinking of having the chance to receive a boon from not just some genie, but from jagad-īśvara, from he whose capability is the cause of the existence of the universe, then if really I could receive from a person of that capability whatsoever I wished, then what would I want? So by addressing the prayer to Krishna in this way, he's implying, even if I were to be offered these things, or even if I had the chance to make a request of the jagad-īśvara, he who's capable of giving me anything, I still wouldn't want any of these things. So we'll get into further detail why one wouldn't want them and why one would want bhakti instead. So after Sriman Mahaprabhu addresses Bhagavan Sri Krishna in this way, it is as though Sri Krishna replies, well then, what do you desire, O sadhu? Tell me, and I will grant you just that. So if you read in between the lines, he says, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want wealth, I don't want followers, I don't want knowledge, etc. Okay, then what do you want? In response, Sriman Mahaprabhu then speaks the second half of the verse. In birth after birth, O Īśvara, let me have causeless bhakti to you. The mention of, quote, in birth after birth, janmani, also conveys disinterest in the attainment of moksha. So, now we come to discussion of the principal subject, the subject of the object being prayed for to the exclusion of all else, quote, ahaitukī bhakti. So, the most significant aspect of the verse under discussion is the prayer made for causeless bhakti. Sriman Mahaprabhu likely chooses to use the qualifier, quote, causeless, or the word ahaitukī, to describe the bhakti he prays for, because of repeated usage by Sri Vedavyas in Srimad Bhagavatam of the term causeless, or ahaitukī, as a qualifier of the highest and purest form of bhakti, the paramount dharma which he endeavored to teach the world by composing Srimad Bhagavatam, as can be observed in celebrated verses in Srimad Bhagavatam, such as the following. So, this choice of words harkens back to the discussion in the Bhagavatam and the descriptions of bhakti, which are qualified by this exact same word. So some of the most prominent examples are as follows. Savai pungso paro dharma yato bhaktir adhoksaje ahaitukī pratiyata yayatma suprasidati. That dharma, because of which causeless and unobstructed bhakti to Bhagavan can come to be, and by which the self, meaning the mind, becomes fully satisfied, is alone the highest dharma for humanity. So Jiva Gosvami discusses this verse right off the bat in the Bhakti Sandarbha and Anucheda 3, as framing the whole discussion that he has of Uttama Bhakti as the Abhideya, as the principal directive of the Shastra. And this comes also right in the second chapter of the Bhagavatam in response to the question of the sages as to what is the Shreyas, what is the most beneficial of all means or ways of seeking goodness, what is the highest good for human beings. And also, secondly, in this famous Atmarama verse, Atmaramas chamunayo nirgranta api urukrame kurvanta ahaitukīm bhaktim itam bhuta guno hari. That even those whose satisfaction is in the self, or Atmaramas, and sages who are free from entanglement, engage in ahaitukī bhakti to urukrama, meaning Bhagavan. Hari is possessed of such qualities. So this verse and the Kumaras, the Shukadeva Goswami, the demonstration that even Brahmagyanis ultimately take to bhakti, specifically this ahaitukī bhakti, this is also a very central theme throughout the Bhagavatam, a central theological speciality of the Bhagavatam. So there also, in this very significant verse, we find this exact phrase. And then we also have Kapiladev speaking in the same way. Madguna shruti matrena mayi sarva guhashayi manogati ravichinna yatha gangam basam budo lakshanam bhakti yogasya nirgunasya hyudaritam ahaitukya vyabhita yabhakti purushottame. Bhakti, which is an uninterrupted, causeless, and unobstructed flow of the mind, solely because of hearing my qualities, towards me, the Supreme Person, who dwells in the hearts of all, like the flow of the water of the Ganga towards the ocean, is said to be the characteristic of Nirguna Bhakti Yoga. So these are just examples, and they're cited here principally just to show how central this phrase ahaitukī bhakti is to the Bhagavatam. So now what do we mean by ahaitukī bhakti? Now we'll look at how the commentators have elaborated on the meaning of this. So here we start going into, the finer points. Sri Swamipad, Sri Jivapad, and Sri Chakravartipad, in reference to these verses, explain the term ahaitukī as a qualifier of bhakti to mean free from pursuit of any other cause, that is, any result other than bhakti itself. So one way of understanding causation is in terms of result. In other words, why do you perform an action? You perform an action to get the fruit of the action. You perform an action to achieve a particular purpose. So the cause of the action is the fruit, or the cause of the action is the thing that's motivating you to perform it. The word prayojana is defined in Nyaya Shastra as that by which someone is engaged to act, or which prompts them to take up an action. So prayojana coming from yojana, coming from the root yuj, to engage or to yoke something. So how is it that, what is this engaging? It's the fruit, or it's the object. That object pushes one or engages one to then do the action in order to get the object. So this is one way the idea of causation is interpreted in the context of bhakti. To say that bhakti is, quote, causeless means that there's no cause that it's being performed to achieve. In other words, there's no particular result one is trying to get from doing it. So the implication when that interpretation is made is that bhakti is performed for its own sake, or it's its own cause. It's something done not for anything other than itself. So this is one way. This is Samipad's, you could say, initial or standard explanation, and that Jiva Gosvami repeats in some contexts, and Vishwanath Chakravarti also repeats in some contexts. However, Jiva Gosvami and Vishwanath Chakravarti also offer alternate interpretations of the word causeless as well. So it's not that the usage of the phrase ahaitukī here has only one intended sense. We see that 3 or more different senses come out in the course of the various commentaries on the verse. So, one reason for bhaktis being described in this way, which is explained by Sri Jiva in his commentary on the Bhagavatam 126, was discussed earlier in the commentary on verse 83 here in Padyavali. So we already had some discussion of that interpretation because it related specifically to the subject matter of that verse. So I'm not going to go into the full quote of that comment, but just the gist of it was, bhakti is itself the supreme satisfaction, and thus one who experiences that satisfaction engages in bhakti solely because of that, and not in pursuit of any other form of or means to satisfaction. So this is based on the underlying psychological analysis that the core prayojana for all beings, which is found in Nyaya Shastra, is that sukh, the sukh sadhana or the means to sukh, and the avoidance of dukh and the means to avoiding dukh, in other words, achieving satisfaction and avoiding suffering, and the means to achieve satisfaction and the means to avoid suffering, anything anyone does falls into one of these categories. This is the sort of broad overall categorization that's made of human motivation. So, seeing all actions as having this fundamental prayojana, then the idea of an action having a cause or another result that it's being performed by is this idea that the action is being used to perform, or rather to achieve, a form of sukha or a removal of dukkha, which is not relevant to the action itself, but is the outcome of the action that produces a result independent of itself. In other words, someone works a job, they make money, they get the money, and the result of their action is the money that they've achieved, and they're more concerned with getting that result out of it than they are with what it's like to perform the task in the course of the job, because they may not like that, or that may not be something satisfying to them, but because the ultimate outcome or the ultimate result of their action is pleasing, then they do it. So in that context, they're not motivated by performing the action itself, they're motivated by the result that's produced by the action. So what Jiva Gosvami is saying here is that bhakti itself is so satisfying that someone will feel sukh to such a profound extent just by doing that act of bhakti, that this idea that there needs to be then a result in the form of removing suffering or a result of achieving sukha outside of the performance of the action evaporates, because that action itself is a greater form of sukh than any outcome it could produce. So when someone experiences that, they become driven by, or rather the drive that they have for sukh is automatically fulfilled within the performance of the action itself, and therefore nothing motivates them other than bhakti itself. So bhakti therefore has no other result or no other, quote, cause to it being performed. It becomes its own cause. So that was the interpretation given in Bhakti Sandarbha 3, and is also given in the Krama Sandarbha reference to 126 in the first canto. So that was the point we discussed earlier. So now a second viewpoint. Alternately, as Sri Chakravarti Pad explains, bhakti, unlike jnana, yoga, and karma, is said to be causeless or ahaitukī because it is its own result. That is, it is the end in and of itself sought by those who perform it. Sri Jiva Pad adds in regard to this interpretation, that causelessness or ahaitukītva of bhakti is shown by the disposition of bhaktas described by Sri Bhagavan in a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam that immediately follows the last of the aforecited verses. So the slight difference in this interpretation is this idea that the bhakti does produce a result, or someone may, or rather that because bhakti is its own result, it doesn't have a cause other than itself. So it's similar to the way Jiva Goswami explained it there, but it slightly differs in how the idea is conceived. But the overall understanding is the same. So this is illustrated in this statement of Kapila Dev, where he says, Salokya sarshti samipya sarupyaikatvam apyuta diyamanam nagrinanti vinamat sevanam janaha. Without my service, people, meaning my bhaktas, do not accept even salokya, sarshti, samipya, sarupya, or ekatva, meaning sayujya, even when these are offered to them by me. So we'll look at all the differences between these categories of moksha later in the section on disinterest in moksha, a little later in the Padyavali, so I'm not elaborating on those here. But Jiva Goswami's comment on this is relevant. So Sri Jiva Pad portrays Sri Bhagavan's statement in this verse as follows. People, that is those who are my own, my bhaktas, do not accept even salokya and so on when offered by me to them without my service. Thus, if they do accept them, then they accept them only for the sake of my service, and not rather solely for their sake. That is, only for the sake of such forms of moksha in and of themselves. This is the meaning. So, the implication of Sri Bhagavan's statement in this verse in the Bhagavatam, this explanation of it, is that Siddha Bhaktas have no desire for anything other than bhakti to Bhagavan. They do not desire moksha, much less worldly wealth and objects of enjoyment. Yet, if such things come to be required for service to Sri Bhagavan, then they are accepted by bhaktas to the extent that is required and conducive to bhakti, without any separate interest in or attachment to them. When realized bhaktas have experience of the superlative blissfulness of bhakti, then even in the midst of their acceptance of worldly objects or moksha, their one-pointedness upon Sri Bhagavan is not thwarted, because they always remain predominantly fixed upon engagement in bhakti to Bhagavan and foster no attachment to the environment, circumstances, or objects that may serve as the locus or instruments for bhakti to Bhagavan at a given time. It also goes without saying in this regard that this capability to sustain such one-pointedness in all circumstances is absent in non-realized bhaktas, that is, sadhakas, who are not free from inclinations, desires, and pursuits of objects other than bhakti. So a siddha bhakta can, truly be, quote, in the world and not of it. But if someone who still has their psyche very much conditioned by things of the world tries to act like someone in that way, they'll end up usually becoming again involved in some, things outside the current of bhakti, because their psyche is still, embedded with vasanas and desires related to those things. And when they remain in the midst of those things, then inevitably those thoughts and interests arise in the mind. And if the person is, not of a certain degree of strength, then they inevitably act or spend time thinking about those things in lieu of bhakti. So therefore, for sadhakas to put oneself right in the middle of all the things that that one's psyche is conditioned to pursue instead of bhakti is not the ideal way to deepen the bhakti samskar. But there is a stage, once that bhakti samskar becomes so predominant that bhav bhakti becomes manifest, then there's a stage where that internal centripetal force, if you will, or the force that keeps the mind one-pointedly fixed upon bhakti becomes so strong that even the presence of these other objects cannot divert one's attention or lead to any other significant vasanas or desires cropping up within the psyche. Still, in this regard, even in regard to realized or siddha bhaktas, one may contend that such bhaktas must feel some degree of pleasure from the environment and the objects with which they engage in bhakti, and that constitutes some taint on the purity of their bhakti. In other words, if you say, oh yeah, all these bhaktas in Vaikuntha, they're just there to serve Bhagavan and for no other reason. But hey, wait a minute here, the cynic will say, Vaikuntha is the most pleasurable place in all of infinity. There's the most beautiful sights, the most beautiful sounds, the most beautiful textures, the most beautiful tastes. And you're in the midst of the most beautiful people, with the most beautiful art, with the most beautiful architecture, with the most fine clothes, fine music, etc. And come on, someone's not going to be, fond of that. There's not going to be some moment where they're thinking, yeah, this is really nice, and independent of just thinking about Narayan. Come on, man, someone with their own, what you could say sort of a strong tendency towards enjoyment might say, is it really even possible that someone could be there but not influenced by that, or that isn't also showing that they're not really one-pointed, they're just, having a good time in a great place with great people. So, to reply to that sort of point, we have this interesting comment of Vishwanath Chakravarti. So he says, if pleasing of one's own senses should occur on the part of a realized one-pointed bhakta, only secondarily, as a result of consideration in all respects of pleasing Krishna's senses, then that is not a fault. Like the dissolution of samsara is not a fault, even when one is a desirer solely of bhakti alone. This is to be understood. So, it's not a fault for a bhakta to go to Goloka or to go to Vaikuntha. In other words, when they have one-pointed bhakti or uttama bhakti, and then they accept the facility for bhakti and for service to Bhagavan that's provided by the state of moksha, that's not proving that they desired moksha all along. That's actually happening not because they want moksha, but because they want bhakti. And then this secondary element is being accepted because it has utility in the course of doing bhakti. So he's saying, if you can accept that a bhakta can accept moksha and not be tainted by that, then what's the problem with saying that the bhakta may also hear the beautiful music played in Vaikuntha? They may also taste the wonderful tambul available in Vaikuntha, or what have you. And that there's no harm in that. There's no fault in that, because actually their chitta is so riveted, if you will, in the spirit of bhakti, or driven by the power of the vritti for bhakti within their psyche is so strong that they're so much, primarily focused on the satisfaction of Krishna, that whatever happens in the wake of that, it's all right. There's nothing to hold at fault to that, and there's no need to consider that in any way taints the one-pointedness or the purity of their bhakti. So, as it is not a fault for a one-pointed bhakta to become liberated from samsara, and engage in bhakti to Bhagavan in his abode of Goloka. So it is not a fault if such a bhakta in the course of endeavoring to serve and satisfy Bhagavan concomitantly experiences some sensual pleasure in the course of doing so. So you can say it's like a figure ground or a matter of accent. In other words, if this is what you're doing, and secondarily that's also there, no harm. But if the other thing is what you're pursuing and bhakti is just the means to that, then that doesn't qualify as ahaitukī bhakti. So the two things might even externally look the same, or you might not even be able to say who's really motivated by what, or what degree of motivation is on this side or that side, and it may be grayscale, or it may be messy, or what have you, and even if there might be, it seem primarily that the person is motivated by the externalities, to say that they don't have any interest in the satisfaction of Krishna is also too much. And then on the other side, that the person could be largely devoted to the satisfaction of Krishna, and then there might still be some lingering or minor elements of external attachment. This is like a gradual, scale that the psyche passes through in the course of the deepening of the predominance, if you will, of the bhakti vasana therein. So it's not for anyone to judge anyone else just based on what they do or what have you. We hear examples like Pundarik Vidyanidhi, who was, wearing silk and with nice hair and smoking a hookah, but is regarded as a bhakta of, par excellence, of great purity and nobility. So it is possible for someone who might look like they're engaging in conventional sensuality to actually be bhakta of a great stature. Similarly, Rai Ramananda and others also rode in palanquins and all this. So, according to the intensity of their bhakti, then the externalities are insignificant or are merely circumstantial. So, moreover, it is explained by Sri Jiva in regard to the aforecited verses that when bhakti is free from desire for anything apart from itself, it is nirgun and pure. So he comments as follows: this bhakti is described as nishkama, or desireless, beyond the gunas, nirguna, pure, that is unmixed with anything else, meaning karma, gyan, etc., kevala, and accomplished by means of its own essential nature, sarup siddha, because of its being possessed of desire only for bhakti. That is, because bhakti and the person who performs it are possessed of desire only for bhakti in and of itself. So this is the critical point. Bhakti matra kamatvat. That when the motivation for the bhakti is only bhakti, that's what is essential to that bhakti being regarded as nirguna, as sarup siddha, as kevala, as nishkama, as all these other qualifiers, as ahaitukī, etc. Everything boils down to the desire that's involved in it. So when it's bhakti for bhakti's sake, when it's bhakti out of desire for bhakti, then it becomes free from all these elements of mundanity, because bhakti itself is beyond such mundanity. So when one's desire is only for that, then one's desire is only for things out of the mundane. And the corollary. So this point is central to the whole discourse of the Bhagavatam. Elaborating on celebrated statements of Sri Samipad in his Bhavarta-dipika in this regard, Sri Jiva also explains that it is specifically with respect to the nature of the desire that motivates one to perform bhakti, that Srimad Bhagavatam, in the second verse, speaks of its principal subject matter as, quote, the highest dharma wherein deceit is utterly rejected. So Jiva Goswami comments on this as follows. The dharma which is fundamentally described in Srimad Bhagavatam is verily the highest, or is parama dharma, because of the description of it herein as being a producer of pure bhakti, or shuddha bhakti, by virtue of its singular intent. So this is the key bit here, right? It has ak-tatparya. There's one intent, or there's one object that this bhakti has. So by virtue of its singular intent, or tatparya, being that of Bhagavan's satisfaction, in accord with the method described in the verses beginning with Savai Pungso Paro Dharma, which was cited earlier, since it is also of such nature that within it, quote, deceit or kaitava, meaning duplicity in the form of the pursuit of extraneous results, is utterly rejected, on account of its, meaning this highest dharma's, being possessed of singular intent upon that, Bhagavan's satisfaction. Even the pursuit of moksha of all types, beginning with salokya, is repudiated by the prefix pra, or utterly, in the word projita, utterly rejected. So this statement of Samipad that's quoted here, interpreting this projita as negating even the pursuit of moksha, this is perhaps one of the most significant of all of Sridhar Swami's comments on the Bhagavatam. And you can see that Kaviraj Goswami gives great emphasis to this in the Charitamrita, and it evidently was deeply influential in the formulation of the Goswami's theology. So, to pinpoint this idea that to equate deceit with separate interest, or with not having the desire to please Bhagavan. In other words, if bhakti is defined as acts pleasing to Bhagavan, and then you're doing this thing called pleasing Bhagavan, or performing acts pleasing Bhagavan, but your purpose is not actually pleasing Bhagavan. Your purpose is actually getting whatever thing you want, then what is that? That's deceit, or that's doing one thing and apparently having one purpose, but actually there's an unspoken other purpose, which is the primary purpose for which you're performing the action. So to quote, trick someone is to do something where the impression of the action created in the other is different than the actual nature of the action taking place, or the actual effect, or the actual thing being pursued by the action. So if you say, I'm doing this thing to please Bhagavan, but really you're not concerned about pleasing Bhagavan, that's just the means by which you're pleasing yourself, then that's here rendered to be kaitavata, or to be a type of deceitfulness. So the key element is this idea of tatparya, and this is what, if you look in the way, and I've emphasized this previously when we discussed Jiva Goswami's definition of priti from Priti Sandarbha, when you dig all the way through it, it all boils down to where he uses this word tatparya, in terms of both the action, the nature of the action, and the intent for which the action is performed. So what is this highest dharma? It's that in which there is singular intent upon Bhagavan's satisfaction. So then again, you can come back to this, which is a topic we discussed fairly recently, that, okay, you say you're only singularly focused on pleasing Bhagavan, but everybody's mind is just running after sukh and trying to avoid dukh, so really that's your underlying motivation. So there is no such thing as one-pointedness upon satisfying Bhagavan. It's impossible. This can be an objection, that you can never get rid of this need to feel sukh and avoid dukh, so whatever you're doing is motivated by that, therefore there's no such thing as, aktat paryata, or this singularity of intent on something other than that. This is nonsense. Someone, a pragmatist maybe, or a cynic, might object like this. So rather the idea is that it is possible, and how is it possible? It's possible because of this state of, if you will, forgetfulness that someone can enter. In other words, we all need oxygen, we all need to breathe. But when you're healthy and you're breathing normally and you're in a safe space with clean air, are you thinking about breathing as you're listening to this class or as I'm talking? Am I worried about my next breath? I'm not. It's just happening automatically. I'm not even thinking about doing it. So although it's extremely necessary, it's arguably the most urgent fundamental need that I have. If I lose my breath, I will die. And, if you have any medical training, when emergency response, the very first thing you have to see is whether the person has an airway and is breathing, in terms of how you analyze the condition of someone who's been in an accident or something like this. So although it's the most fundamental need, at the same time, it's something that is on a daily basis. You might not even remember even once in a day that you're breathing. You might just live your whole day on autopilot, so to speak. So something like that, this is just an analogy I'm offering. If someone becomes absorbed in bhakti, this idea that there's also this tendency in the psyche to feel pleasure, it becomes like peripheral. Like they're so steeped in the beauty, the richness of Bhagavan, of the acts of bhakti, that they're not even thinking about that. It's just so automatic and so fundamental that really they're not motivated by it. It's just something that's there and happening without any necessarily cognitive, separate, or calculated pursuit. It's just something that is required, and when it's being acquired automatically, it's just there. And so someone's actually focused on satisfying Bhagavan, and that really is what they're principally absorbed in. And they really do care about that. And, effortlessly, that you could say minor compensation, or that, the exchange of the flow of the energy to sustain them just, comes about in a natural consequence of that, such that it's suitable to say that it's effectively non-existent because of its negligible, non-prominent position, if you will. So, further point in this regard from Jiva Gosvami, this is from the Bhakti Sandarbha. Going back to this idea of cheating or pursuing something intentionally for this calculated sense of satisfaction, quote, for oneself, or having a whole concept of one's own satisfaction independent of that of Bhagavan, he nails it down, if you will, using this same language of the second verse of the Bhagavatam, this word kaitava, as follows. So that bhakti, further, is to be known of two types: akaitava, non-deceitful, and sakaitava, deceitful. So he's inferring, so to speak, if the Bhagavatam is talking about what is kaitava projita, or free from kaitava, that implies that there is kaitava. So that would imply then that bhakti can be either deceitful or non-deceitful. So what then is the criterion by which deceit is established? This is what he's explaining in this passage. If there is desirousness only of that is of bhakti itself, there is akaitavatva, or non-deceitfulness. And if there is desirousness related to another, that is, an object other than bhakti, there is kaitavatva, deceitfulness. This exact non-deceitful bhakti was also described earlier as being, quote, unconditional, or akinchana, literally without anything, because of its having no desire for anything extraneous to itself. Also, evidence in regard to its, meaning bhakti in general's, being of both types, that is, potentially being either non-deceitful or deceitful, based on the desire that motivates its enactment, is to be understood from the second verse of Bhagavatam, where he says, here in Bhagavatam, the highest dharma completely free from deceit. Accordingly, it is also stated in the 7th canto, 7.752, quote, Hari is pleased by taintless bhakti, all else is a sham. So another prominent point, which Jiva Gosvami also gives significant discussion of in the Bhakti Sandarbha, which parallels this. The final statement cited in this commentary is made by Prahlad Maharaj to his classmates. Quote, O sons of the Asuras, neither being a twice-born, being a deva, or being a rishi, nor conduct, nor being greatly knowledgeable, nor charity, nor austerity, nor worship, nor cleanliness, nor rites, are able to please Mukunda. Hari is pleased by taintless bhakti, all else is a sham. So what is it that taints bhakti? Just as bhakti can be deceitful if it has this other motivation, similarly it can be described as tainted. So Jiva Gosvami clarifies the concept of taint here, or this mal, with his comment as follows. Quote, by taintless means by desireless, nishkama. So this is like the sutra, that the taint, the contamination is produced by desire. So what you desire is the very heart of the whole thing. When one's desire is the desire that motivates the enactment of bhakti is bhakti itself, then it is untainted. But when the desire that is motivating you to enact the bhakti is something other than bhakti, then that puts a taint on the bhakti. And when it's tainted, then he calls it a sham. So bidambana means mere acting. So you could also translate it as pantomime. So if you've seen like a mime acting out some way, trying to make someone think that they're doing some particular action, then the person is, in other words, acting in a way that looks just like the way the action is meant to perform. Externally, you can't say if this is, quote, tainted or untainted. It looks just fine. But just as an actor might put on an act and you can't even tell that the person is actually acting. You might think that they're actually feeling happy or they're actually feeling sad right now when they, act out some particular emotion. The fact that they're actually acting and not feeling is a really good actor can conceal that, such that when you watch a movie, you get the impression that this person is actually feeling those things. So similarly, someone can do bhakti really nice, but actually have the ill motive still inside. And how one is motivated isn't necessarily visible in the way that they enact whatever it is that they might be doing. So what the criterion then is the inner motivation that the person has. Therefore, the bhakti of even a sakam bhakta, or a bhakta desirous of some object other than bhakti, being said to be mere acting, is because of its being a mere imitation of bhakti, on account of the intention within it of bhakti's being a mere means to a personal object. That is, an object desired by oneself for an interest separate from bhakti and Bhagavan's satisfaction. So you're, quote, imitating actual bhakti when you're doing the thing that is pleasing to Bhagavan, but yet you're actually not trying to please Bhagavan for real. As actors sometimes perform such imitation of others, so it is such. That is, so persons with desires, whether they consider themselves or are considered by others to be bhaktas or not, are actually just imitators of actual bhaktas until they become free from such desires. Further in this regard, that is, in regard to pure bhaktis being performed without desires related to this world or the next, being free from desire related to this world is to be understood to also consist of the absence of acquiring a livelihood, prestige, and so forth by means of bhakti. So, Jiva Gosvami, so to speak, doesn't spare any of us, or by us, I mean people like me, who are not free from, all of these things. Then, in other words, to say that if one has even a tinge of desire for pratishta, then bhakti is actually a sham, or is actually an act and not really an act of bhakti. Because one might want to please Bhagavan, but they also want this, recognition in society of being someone who does so. or they want, whatever benefits come from having a certain status in society. So to perform bhakti free from these other desires, without doing that, one is here called an imitator. So essentially, no one except a siddha bhakta is accepted as an actual bhakta. Any sadhaka here is basically classified as an imitator. So in this sense, that doesn't mean, well, since you're imitating, you shouldn't do that. In other words, you still have to practice, and it's not that the imitation itself is producing the result, but that one has to practice. But the main thing is not just being expert at rituals or tunes or memorization or this or that, but actually doing the inner work such that one's psyche can become free from all of these other motivations, and one can actually, without deceit or without a taint, in a non-imitative way, actually perform an action to please Bhagavan just for the sake of pleasing Bhagavan. So like we have the saying in English, goodness for goodness sake. So to actually be good for goodness sake is in one sense the whole problem or the whole challenge of the entire thing. And everything else is more or less just cultural trappings and social convenience. And regardless of how much one might, be perceived as knowledgeable or skilled in the various arts associated with bhakti, or have a role in some prestigious institution or temple or social context in which bhakti is performed, all of that is utterly irrelevant. And what's ultimately really determines whether what one's doing is free from deceit, free from intimidation, free from taint, is that relative purity or relative desirelessness of the psyche, and the extent to which the guiding, the driving desire is actually the desire to serve and satisfy Bhagavan. So we can draw from this the principle then that the greatness of the bhakta is the extent of his nishkamata, the extent of his desirelessness. Not, he might not even be able to play the kirtals in the rhythm, so to speak. He might just be like clanking along, so to speak. But that person could actually, be the bhakta of the highest stature, that people in society just think, oh, whenever this person's here, it's just disturbing the kirtan, or whatever, whatever the case may be. So Bhagavan is seeing this before anything else. So these are the main points to derive. So then to get back to, to tie this back to the overall discussion, to say that bhakti is, quote, ahaitukī, or without cause, is to say that it's free from any of these other tainting desires. So causeless, desireless, you can draw an equation between these two things and say for bhakti to be causeless, it has to be desireless. In other words, the only desire that motivates it is the desire for bhakti itself, because the sukh that everyone is seeking is coming from the bhakti itself, and therefore there's no need or desire to pursue anything extraneous to that. So this is the central subject. I'll just read one more passage and then conclude for today, because this also just ties in well. And I think from here we can get a segue to further discussion. So this statement here of Jiva Gosvami is an elaboration on a state of Prahlad Maharaj. So Prahlad Maharaj is advising his classmates, saying, this is what pleases Bhagavan, this taintless bhakti. You should do that, in essence. So then Prahlad Maharaj doesn't just tell other people to do it, he actually does it. So that's shown later in the Bhagavatam, when Nrsingadev offers him a boon. So Prahlad Maharaj embodies the taintless bhakti that he teaches in the aforecited verse when he responds to Bhagavan Nrsimha. After Bhagavan repeatedly requests Prahlad to accept a boon from him, as though enticing Prahlad to ask for some form of worldly enjoyment or moksha. So Prahlad replies when Bhagavan offers him whatever he wants and says, no, I want you to take a boon, and behooves him, so to speak. He says, one who desires benedictions from you is not a servant. He is certainly a merchant. He seeks a great reward in the form of valuable possessions like elephants, horses, and chariots, and a high position like that of Indra or Brahma, in exchange for offering you just a few leaves, flowers, and foods. This is a good business. You just buy a few fruits, few flowers, you take them to the temple, and then you get, millions, crores, whatever currency you like, Is it that easy? You just, spend, a few dollars, few rupees, buy a few things, you pray, and then he gives you all this vast amount. This is a good business, good return on your investment. So he's saying someone who thinks like that, he's not a servant, he's a merchant. One who is desirous of a blessing for oneself from a master is certainly not a genuine servant. So here by blessing it means a reward, a particular favor. One who gives a blessing, desiring one's own mastership over a servant, is not a genuine master either. I, however, am your desireless bhakta, and you are my guileless master. So if a bhakta only does service to get some benefit, he's not truly a bhakta. And if a master gives rewards to people not really for their well-being and not really out of care for them, but only so that the person just keeps serving them and worshipping them, then that's not also truly being a guardian or truly being a shelter and a source of support and protection for another. So if I were to want something from you and you were to just want adoration from me, then we would both be derelict in our respective roles. But I'm not doing that, and I have faith that you're not doing that. So otherwise, we would both have an interest. That is, we both would have ulterior motives, like a king and a courtier. So ministers, courtiers, they praise the king, they perform duties of the king, and then they get, a livelihood, and they get a status, and they get all these benefits from doing so. And they wouldn't do it if they didn't get those benefits. Similarly, a king, he supports all these members of his cabinet and so on, because he needs, people to do these different tasks, and he wants, people to do all these things for him. And if they don't do those things, he wouldn't provide what he does for them. So it's all conditional. Everyone has some ulterior interest or motive for performing their respective activities. So there's a nice point of Baladeva Debushan in his comment on the Gita 934, this Manmana Bhavamadbhakto, where he uses this same example, saying, don't be like the minister, the courtier of a king, who is a bhakta of the king, but his mind is on his family and his own separate things. So he's a bhakta of one, but his mind is in another. He's saying, be both manmana and madbhakta. Be a person the person that they're doing bhakti to and the place that their mind is the same. Don't separate these two. This is essentially, work versus devotion. So, O best among givers of boons, if you wish to bestow desired boons upon me, then from you, I pray for the boon of non-growth, that is, the non-occurrence within my heart of desires. So you might say, oh, come on, desires are all right, no big deal. Few desires here and there, no harm to anybody, right? So, worldly speaking, no, we don't need to hamper on anybody. But from those who aspire to this rarefied thing called Uttama Bhakti, called the Parama Dharma, then here's all the problems that those desires create for you. Prahlad lists them as follows. Don't let the growth of in my heart any desires, by the appearance of which the senses, the mind, the vital airs, the body, dharma, composure, intelligence, modesty, beauty, strength, remembrance, and truthfulness are lost. That is, are led in the wrong way, such that they fail to come in touch with you and your madhurya. So the essence of this point, which comes also in another one of the comments, which is a heavy point, is essentially one contrary desire can drag one into, the thickest of the thick of worldly entanglement. Just one desire. And can lead to the contamination of the mind, the body, the dignity, the conduct, everything of a person. So it's really the desires we have that shape the thoughts that we have, the life that we live, the behavior that we perform, ultimately the destiny that we experience, and we're living out now the outcome of the desires that we fostered and acted on in the past. Yat chittam tanmayo bhasham etad guyam sanatanam. The eternal secret, if you will, described in the Upanishads and the Mahabharata, is that what your mind is absorbed in, that inevitably will be. And what absorbs the mind? Desire. So what your mind becomes absorbed in is an outcome of what you desire. So how you foster your desires, there's nothing more ultimately significant and influential than this. So that's why our acaryas, that's why the Bhagavatam is coming so cracking on this point so strongly and so finely, because this is the cornerstone of the entire destiny that anyone is going to live out. And so to deeply understand the role that desire plays in how the psyche works, as well as the ultimate question, what's really worth desiring? What should I desire and what things should I not desire? And what desire should I not act on or further nourish? This is the fundamental orientation that informs everything about how one lives and all the moment-to-moment decisions and actions that one performs, and definitely what will shape the degree of success that one has on the path of bhakti. So to learn that prem is the purushartha, to learn that the goal of life is to achieve prem, is to satisfy Bhagavan, just truly deeply grasping this concept, and then to the best of one's ability, streamlining, aiming, attuning, drawing in, the thoughts, the desires that one fosters, the actions that one's performed, in towards that ideal. Every sadhana, every teaching, all these books, all these prayers, all these kirtans, all these things, this is what they're all for. And this is the fruit that they can all ultimately bear. So here in the 4th verse of the Shikshastakam, Mahaprabhu is just saying it very straight. I don't want this, that, or anything. I want ahaitukī bhakti and nothing else. And that point that we made, it's also made by Jiva Gosvami with reference to these one verse that comes 3 times in the 6th canto, 10th canto, and 11th canto, which will come later in this discussion. Nanaka prishtam, nachaparameshtam, where this, not this, not this, not this. This same parallel verse comes 3 times with minor variegation. And that the negative principle placed before the objects of negation, this is, a grammatical punch, if you will, or a grammatical way of showing, the strength or the amount of emphasis that's trying to be put on this point. So again, it's beyond just simply knowing these things, because you can have the theory in your head, but that doesn't stop the samskaras in your psyche from still functioning and from all kinds of different thoughts and desires for contrary things from coming up. So we need a strong, crisp grasp of these principles, and then it's doing the work, so to speak, or it's the practice of sadhana that can then bring the psyche in tune with the ideals that we've used the faculty of the intellect to elect or to, establish as the guidelines or the pillars of light or the objects that we seek in our life. So this bringing into sync, if you will, the ideals and the psyche's attunement with them, this is what is sought by sadhana bhakti, and this is what makes someone, quote unquote, a mahatma, according to Niti Shastra, someone whose thoughts, words, and actions are all in perfect attunement. So this is what is aspired for, and just as someone whose speech and actions are not in attune with what they're actually thinking is called a trickster, similarly, frankly speaking, sadhakas, people who are not at this stage of one-pointedness, are labeled here by the Bhagavatam itself as deceitful, or as still having the presence of these ulterior interests or taints in their thoughts and actions. So to be free from deceit, in other words, to have true integrity, is a very, very high ideal. And sometimes we might, in a conventional sense, have a sense of being an honest person or an upstanding person or a person of integrity. But to truly, according to these spiritual ideals, be a person of integrity is, the most noble, worshipable state of purity that we can conceive. So we deeply aspire to that, and we, to recognize, to accept the absence of that and the residual presence of what is contrary to that within ourselves is also part of the process of purification and aspiration for that. So let me stop here. I don't mean to go on too long here with further elaboration, but we will go into even more detail than this. We're just getting started. So this is going to be an ongoing, thorough discussion of this very central topic. So we'll take it up next time. I'll conclude here. If anyone would like to comment, question, or correct anything, please feel free to do so. Yes, I see a hand.
Jai Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe. Pranams Baba. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for this beautiful Harikatha. And I just have two little questions. They are about the meanings of two words that I am not familiar with. Please tell, like, when you, Prahlad, and please correct me if my pronunciation is wrong of these words. You said that Prahlad Maharaj called himself I am a guileless bhakta. I just don't know this word in English, guileless. Could you please give a synonym of the word? Because English is not my first language, so I'm just a little bit
sure.
lost in the meaning.
Guile means like being tricky or being deceitful. So guileless means being sincere, genuine.
Okay. This is clear. Thank you very much. And the second question, please excuse my uneducatedness in Sanskrit language. When you described Nirgun Bhakti, you said that Nirgun Bhakti is the Bhakti which is free from Gyan, Karma, etc. Kevala. So I don't know what the word Kevala means. Could you please...
The word Kevala means only, or sometimes it literally can be taken in a sense of isolated. So it just means it's, as in the definition of Uttama Bhakti, Jnana Karma Anavrita, uncovered. Another way of singling that is just to say it's isolated from, or it's separate from those things.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, Vidiji, Pranam.
Pranam, Teshade. I'm just listening to the lecture and just my mind trying to scan all the references that I still remember, I think. It's quite a comprehensive thing that I want to say, but let me just zip it to one. So in Madhura Kadambini, there is a description of ruchi, and there are two types of ruchi. One is that someone may be, expressing anubhavs, and stimuli or udipanas may be coming from beautifully performed art, devotional art, let's say kirtan, singing beautiful kirtan. Somebody's ruchi is enhanced by beautiful performance. And another type of ruchi is regardless of the quality of art, the bhakta is enhanced, bhakta's bhakti is enhanced, regardless of that. So, am I correct to quote this from Madhura Kadambini, as I said it? Because I don't really exactly remember the explanation, but I think that was what I remember.
Yeah, more. I mean, I don't have it right in front of me, but yeah, more or less. Technically speaking, the terminology of rasa anubhava, that would be something that someone beyond the stage of ruti at the siddha stage would experience. But there is, just as you described, the idea that at the stage of ruchi, there is the experience that the quality of the, let's say, the tune or the elements of the kirtan are felt to be significantly supportive of one's ability to focus and appreciate it, whereas at a higher stage, one feels a deep sense of absorption irrespective of the relative artistic quality of what's going on.
So is this a reference to ruchi, is the actual stage of ruchi as we progress from Anatani forward?
Sorry, what was the last bit?
Is this a reference to ruchi in Madhura Kadambini, exactly describing the stage of ruchi as we go from Anatani forward? Or it just simply says ruchi as a casual description of someone's enchantments, occasional enchantment here and there?
I mean, I'd have to look up the exact context. This isn't what we discussed today, but generally speaking, it refers to the person who is at that stage of sadhana.
Okay, that's clear. Okay, fine. So, we're listening to question the fact that because what we hear is, and I'm quite, for a long time I'm hearing that actually, of course, we know Bhakti is conscious participation or conscious living, and one's selection of action is very important. The motivation is crucial. So I understand that, and there's a lot of, like you described, not many leeway of just going through the bhakti and still maintaining one's own natural tendencies of being simply yourself, who has tendency to actually be happy in this material body, but not necessarily, transgressing any type of conduct. But, what I'm saying is that, where's the, for example, we have a person who is a bhakta, but he's professional artist. Let's say he is painter. There's an example of, in Sri Sampradaya, I believe, where one of those disciples was a professional fighter. You might know the story. Professional fighter who was actually, his profession was to basically fight on the stage. I think some martial art, whatever. So his mode of maintenance was basically doing some special type of art. And in order to do this art, you have to be absorbed in what you do. Same thing with artists. In order to maintain themselves, they have to be absorbed in beauty. And this is how they maintain their life. And also this is how they their samskara for that kind of profession will affect their perception of bhakti as well. I don't think you can separate the two. And from their angle, to look at bhakti as something which is devoid of any type of beauty, the beauty may be deceitful, the art may be something that's actually take you away from bhakti, may be difficult to comprehend. And what comes to mind right now is the verse from Bhagavad Gita that even saints have to act according to their nature. You cannot stop acting, like because we always act according to our nature we are born with. Of course, the things may change. The whole idea of my understanding is the whole idea of bhakti is to serve Bhagavan within one's own given facilities. And let's correct me, please. What I see, Shastra describes the ideal objective, the ideal for what we want to obtain. Yet, the practical life, doesn't provide that facilities for everybody in every moment, because we are all different entities with completely different samskaras, different type of perception of reality. So I'm just trying to put this out to express that there's this variegatedness into how someone perceives sadhana bhakti. Also, what comes to mind is the verse. Maybe it's off, but Sanatana Gosvami says this verse. Vaishnavera kriya mudra vigyana bhujaya. That you can really say who bhakta is just by looking at our bhakta's external activities. So I'd like to link all these things that I mentioned to express that there is variegatedness within the sadhana bhakti, although there is a path is very clearly lined up, but individual performance is somebody that someone has to judge according to one's own capacity, one's own predisposition and desires. And of course, you mentioned desires, which is super important, the only thing that will guide us. So I would just basically highlight that there's because anyway, I just stop here just to leave it at it and not to go longer. I was wondering if you can comment on how I presented the other side of reality.
Well, I can just say there's a statement in the Sindhu where Rupa Goswami also, after surveying the Bhakti-angas, encourages people to engage in Bhakti-angas according to their vasana. So, in other words, people who have a predilection towards activities of a particular type, there's some type of bhakti that'll suit them. That's the idea, that there's so many categories, so many ways that bhakti can be performed. 64 in the, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, hundreds more in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, and, even in the definition of Uttama Bhakti, Anushilanam, Jiva Goswami explains the Shil Dhatu means any verb in the book, so to speak. So, any action can be an act of bhakti provided it has the necessary characteristics. So one doesn't need to go against the grain, so to speak, of that aspect of the swabhava. But arguably the harder part, that is not optional, is to go through the process of purging the desires one has for all these types of pleasure other than pleasures that can be experienced in the context of bhakti. And that hurts. That's not fun all the time. That requires discipline. That, requires character. That requires shraddha. That requires composure. That requires the whole book of virtues. And that's the struggle that sadhakas go through. So they don't need to make it harder for themselves than it has to be. But at the same time, they have to understand that, it's not just, a walk in the park, so to speak. They can make it one, they can take it lightly if they want, but according to the depth that they wish to go. And obviously it's not that you can go all that far beyond your capacity. There's a certain, what you could call wiggle room, so to speak, where, according to the level of purification that you have, you can aspire for one that is somewhat greater than where you're at now. You can't necessarily just immediately try to do what is, said to have been done by so-and-so Mahatma or so-and-so Goswami or so-and-so right off the bat. But if someone can understand, have self-knowledge about where they are, self-knowledge about their own capacity, self-knowledge about their how they can best make use of their circumstances, then they can do their best to be progressive with the guidance of their guru and the, heart, the heart with which they come to the path.
Yeah. So at one point, when you presented the whole situation in the class, I was thinking, there was a question appearing in my head, in my mind. Do Bhaktas laugh and joke? Because it sounded so severe, There's no pleasure involved at all. There's happiness is looked down upon. And look, do actually Bhaktas have it, did they laugh?
I'm surprised though the question would come up. We were talking all about the pleasure that's experienced in bhakti. There's no greater pleasure than the pleasure of bhakti. And we all love laughing. We all love joking. Why wouldn't you think, oh yeah, we're going to laugh all the time because we're going to be feeling, all the joy of the humor that bhaktas have. Who tells funnier jokes than Radharani's friends? Come on!
Yeah, so my impression of the spiritual life is it's a sober, but it's happy experience, really. Like, it has to have this, sense of pleasure coming from relationships, from beauty surrounding us. I mean, I'm not to be caught up in beauty or as a separate item, just going to, art galleries. It's not that. What I'm saying is that the expression of bhakti requires sort of beauty, the environmental beauty. I'm not saying like to stress on it, but it's helpful, or it's a natural thing. It's my understanding that you want to create everything, whatever you do around, beautiful. Simple, beautiful expression of life. I'm just simply wanted to say that.
All right, very well.
Thank you.
Cheers. Then we can conclude for today, I think. And if we're so blessed, then in our next reading, we'll go further into this nitty-gritty, if you will. And so far, we've talked about this idea of desiring things other than bhakti. So the discussion will now go into what it actually means to desire bhakti, and then subcategory hierarchies of the desires that are implied in this general category called desire for bhakti. So we'll look at different verses in the 10th canto where these points are drawn out by Sanatana Gosvami and Jiva Gosvami, and other interesting points of richness which can help us hold in our bullseye or hold in our aim clearly what is most fruitful to aspire for. So with that I conclude. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Shyam.